Good afternoon, my name is Taylor Sutton, and I'm a sophomore in liberal arts studies here at the college. On behalf of Chesapeake's Division of Arts and Sciences and the Honors Council, I'd like to welcome you to our debate. The topic for debate today is the legalization of gay marriage in all of the states. This is a relevant issue since it is question 6 on the ballot. And due to the controversial nature of this topic, we ask that everyone please be respectful to our debaters and keep in mind this quote by Aristotle. It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. So please keep all comments to yourself while the debaters are speaking. The format of this debate is that each debater gets 7 minutes to talk. Between the first and 6th minute, they may ask points of information from one another. Then after that will be a Q&A session from the floor. We will be handing out 3x5 cards to everyone where you can write down a question that you would like to be asked once it is time for that part of the debate. We will ask you to pass them to either Professor Harper or Dean Welsh. After that, we will be having a 5-minute closing from each of our debaters. So let's meet our debaters. Both of them are representatives of the British National Debate Team. First, we have Ettie, recently graduated in English Literature and plans to continue graduate studies in the UK at the university. Ettie was heavily involved in the student politics, journalism, theater, and welfare services. She volunteers on a number of educational and pastoral schemes for underprivileged youngsters and looks forward to working as a mentor, debate coach, and helpline counselor in the coming year. Ettie visited the U.S. as a Fulbright Special Programs Scholar in 2011 and looks forward to returning to see more of the wonderful USA. We also have Willard, and he is was a student of the University of West of England, Bristol University, and Middle Temple. He holds a degree in law and a master's degree in international criminal justice. As a debater, he was once the 7th best speaker in the world and is one of the very small numbers of speakers to have reached the final rounds of the Oxford, Cambridge, the Mace, and the European Championships and the World Championships, and is the only person ever to win the WUDC Funniest Speaker in the World Comedy Prize more than once. Since leaving university, Willard has had a successful career as a journalist and documentary filmmaker for the BBC. He has reported from the Israel-Lebanon War, covered piracy off the Horn of Africa, made the BBC's flagship film on the Madoff scandal, and spent the winter of 2010 embedded with the U.S. Marines of Afghanistan. So now that you have met our debaters, we'd like to begin our debate, starting with Willard.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out to see us, if you'll forgive that pun at the start of the debate. Ladies and gentlemen, sorry. Someone's so enjoying our performance that he feels that he has to run on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, when I look into the eyes of a beautiful woman, or beautiful man, or beautiful dog, there's nothing I think of more than saying to that person, what we've got here, baby, is beautiful. Why don't we just get the state involved? Because, you know, when I'm out on a windy walk with my significant other, there's nothing I love more than imagining Mitt Romney joining me on that walk. And ladies and gentlemen, I say that while Proposition 6 in Maryland will guarantee gay marriage in Maryland if you vote for it, it won't guarantee gay marriage in Mississippi. And if you got married, if 2 men or 2 women got married in Maryland, that marriage wouldn't be recognised in Mississippi. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, we need to go a lot further than Proposition 6. We need to go a lot further than just guaranteeing gay marriage in all the states. Ladies and gentlemen, I would say on this side of the House that the best way to legalise gay marriage throughout the 50 states would be for the state to step back from all recognition of marriage. It should step back from any kind of tax breaks that it gives marriage. It should step back from any kind of benefits that accrue in death tax, and so on and so forth. The only limitations the state should put on who you fall in love with and who you marry should be an age of consent, which I think should be around the age that sex is legal, and also there should be a provision for divorce to exist, but that should be wholly based in the civil courts, and it should be based entirely on a division of assets and a reasonable way to look after the children. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that the only way to achieve true marriage equality is to step back from this idea that marriage is something that the state should want you to do and something that the state should encourage. Why is that, ladies and gentlemen? Well, fundamentally, I think this comes down to what is the role of the state? Ask yourself the question, is it the role of the state to tell you who you can fall in love with? Is it the role of the state to say what a holy book says about marriage is or isn't? Is it the role of the state to to lay down a definition that if it favours gay people, it upsets the religious, and if it favours religious people, it upsets the homosexual community. We say, ladies and gentlemen, absolutely it is wrong for the state to recognise marriage. We've got to ask ourselves the question, why does the state recognise marriage at all? Well, fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, it's a historical artefact dating back to about the 12th century, whereby states decided they wanted to know who was marrying who, precisely for the reason they wanted some people to avoid marrying other people. As we move forward through history, that remained, and marriage has always been a very fundamental part of society, but marriage has always been different, ladies and gentlemen. Back in colonial times, marriage was a contract between a man and his property. So if I married Ettie, I would own her, literally outright, lock, stock and barrel. I'll take you in a moment, but by the time we'd moved on towards the Civil War, marriage was something that was legal only between white men and white women. Even as late as the 1960s, interracial marriage was forbidden by law in many states. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we turn and society has changed even further, and men are not allowed to marry men, or women are not allowed to marry women. There's been a constant social change, and at every single turn, people have been disenfranchised. People have been told by the state, what you are doing is wrong, and eventually society has moved forward. And ladies and gentlemen, what I want to do in this proposal is I want to say I don't want anyone to be disenfranchised. Before we came here, we spent 4 weeks in Texas, and I'm pretty sure I met a man who was quite keen to marry his Civil War era canon. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't mind if he marries that canon. As far as I'm concerned, that's no business of mine. Who marries who? And I don't think it should be the state's business either. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'd legalise any kind of marriage. When I say legalise any kind of marriage, we would just step the state back from any kind of recognition of marriage. Because I think it's the state getting involved in exactly this kind of thing that causes so many problems. So let's get down to the fundamental nature of marriage and ask ourselves the question, is a marriage a legal contract between two individuals that the court should rule on, or is it a religious ceremony? Well, it's a strange hybrid of the two, because precisely those historical reasons that I brought up earlier. But it's not as though you have to get a state certificate to determine exactly what is or isn't a funeral. It's not as though you need a state certificate to determine what is or isn't a christening. If you become a godparent, there's no legal rights that accrue to that. We don't criminalise the failings of marriage. We don't criminalise adultery. We don't criminalise being a bad husband or being a bad wife, ladies and gentlemen. Those aren't necessarily actionable in law. Ultimately, what's happened is we've developed into a situation where what began as religious observances, sanctifying a marriage, have become this sort of strange, totally unenforceable legal contract, which allows certain people to benefit from it, but completely disenfranchises the rest of society if you don't fit into society's predetermined box of what is or isn't right to be a marriage. And the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, law is never going to move as quickly as society is. I mean, look at the last 200 years. As I mentioned, we're only, people in this room's grandparents were not allowed to have been interracially married. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, as long as the state keeps interfering in these religious institutions, then it's going to consistently keep defining things for the fear of offending religious people. It's an enormous pillar of religion, ladies and gentlemen, and there is a danger of the state of interfering. There's a real danger of the state forcing gay marriages to happen in Catholic churches, forcing gay marriage to happen in Protestant churches, and we say no, that nobody should be forced to do anything they want to do. If gay people want to get married and they can find a priest who's willing to do the sacrament, fine. If a Catholic priest doesn't want to perform that ceremony, fine. We say, ladies and gentlemen, it's no business of the state to turn around and say gay people can't get married, but equally it's a vast violation of the rights of Catholic priests to say they have to go against their holy book and carry out these marriages. So, ladies and gentlemen, what happens when you do have the state involved in this? Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see in places like France, where religion and the state are forced to make choices against each other, you end up with enormous riots, enormous disconnections, and equally, ladies and gentlemen, you see enormous unfairness and enormous inequality when the gay community, and even communities like the polygamous community, as I said, I've got no problem with polygamous marriage. I don't see why a marriage to 3 wives is any better or worse than a marriage to 1 wife. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, fundamentally, The state has no role in this. It's not the state's business to decide who gets married, who doesn't get married. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'd legalise gay marriage. And the way we'd legalise gay marriage is by turning around, as the state, washing our hands of it and saying it's down to the individuals involved. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, when Willard joked just then that he and I could get married, I thought to myself, well, that's a bit offensive, because frankly, he ought to be asking me in a more romantic way if he's going to do that. And that was the only issue I had with that particular example. But when I felt that way about this idea of a marriage, this offhand joke just being chucked out in public, the reason it offended me was because I thought, well, marriage is about individuals, isn't it? It's not the kind of thing that we should make light of. It's not the kind of thing that, although he might joke about it, a man who wants to marry his Civil War era canon should really be joking about, because it's more important than that, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to talk to you about the unique, special position that marriage plays in our society, and why Willard's solution to the vexed problem of whether men should be allowed to marry other men and women should be allowed to marry other women is just a cop-out. He's just tried to get out of the problem of who should be allowed to get married to one another by saying no one's going to do it, no one, anywhere, problem solved, and it simply ignores the real issue. So firstly, I'm going to chat about why marriage is more than a civil issue. It's not like dissolving a business. It is a unique, social, public, community-based activity, and it needs a very specific kind of legal backing for that to really matter. And secondly, I'm going to talk about why the state isn't an irrelevant agent in this relationship. The state is there to back up and reinforce and protect that very special commitment that two people make to one another. And I'm going to talk about why it's very important that you get to be able to do that, whether you're heterosexual, whether you're homosexual, whether you really love Civil War era canons, perhaps, but that might be a future issue. So briefly, some rebuttal. Because he said that the way he essentially tried to argue that you can honour marriage more and you can give it more meaning. Sorry, to rephrase that. You honour relationships more by letting the state step back from them. But the problem with total neutrality, when the state has no involvement, is that firstly, you allow older forms of tradition to dominate. Because if no marriages mean anything anymore, and if my civil marriage with another woman means nothing legally, the things that have continued meaning are the things that exist in our very oldest traditions, the things that we grew up with. And what that reinforces is the idea that only man-woman and woman-man marriages really mean anything because they used to have legal backing. And we think that traditions kind of run deeper than a lot of what the law would seek to change. He also said that law will never move as quickly as society does, and then tried to use that as an argument for getting rid of the power that the state has to set the agenda for future generations. Because I think it's outrageous that a woman and a woman who have been married for, say, 35 years don't have the right to go into the emergency room and make medical decisions for one another if they have recognized their commitment to each other, if they say, you are the most important person in my life and I want to share that with you. I think it's outrageous that when a man dies before his male partner, he doesn't have any inheritance rights and he could pay hundreds of thousands of dollars of tax on something when really he's a surviving spouse. And if the state would step in and say, look, there's a problem, we need to get recognizing the relationships that people really have in reality, then the state could actually use that for good. And it could set its own agenda and it could push for the kind of progressive politics that we probably wouldn't see in places, well, to take Willard's example, you know, this gay couple in Mississippi. They get left behind if the state doesn't step in and try and change things. And he said, yeah, you know, it's outrageous that until 1967, the US Supreme Court had taken no action on the issue of interracial marriage. And it allowed this horribly racist policy to continue, that an interracial marriage wasn't a legal one. Well, I'll draw an exact analogy there and say that if Willard's not going to step in and let the law take responsibility for how people really live their lives in homosexual relationships, then he's doing the exact same thing. He's allowing grossly homophobic values to perpetuate. And he also said that because he's going to get rid of marriages, gay people just need to find, say, a Catholic priest who is willing to perform this sacrament, and then they'll have a religious marriage, but they won't have a legal one. So firstly, he recognizes that the importance of marriage is chiefly symbolic for many people. He gets that people want to get married because they want to share in a religious community, and they want to say to everyone else around them, look, I had a ceremony. Look, this person means more to me than just my live-in boyfriend of 15 years. They are special, and I want to recognize that in front of God. And the fact is that I think it's extremely unlikely, and I think you'll agree with me there, that a Catholic priest anywhere in the USA would perform a religious marriage for a gay couple unless some pressure was placed upon him to do that. And likewise, many of our religions, because religions, being vested in our oldest traditions, typically don't move with the times as quickly as they might do. And realistically, he's just going to shut out these gay couples if he says it's all up to the individual and they can choose to do what they want. I say it's unacceptable if a religious person isn't willing to marry me. And so, like, the state needs to get inside that relationship. But also, I say that there are two different things going on when you get married. There's something civil, and there may be something religious. And the religious bit might be really important to me, but the civil bit is the thing the state should be responsible. And in essence, the religious marriage thing is optional. So firstly, why is marriage more than like a sort of business contract, if you will? Well, it needs to come from the state, and it needs to be more than the kind of thing that you just sign your name on the dotted line next to, a bit like saying, I agree to buy a printer and a telephone line with this person, and we agree to call ourselves Bailey King Corp. It's more than that. So it comes from the public recognition within your community that you are making a commitment to each other and you're going to rely upon each other. And it's a contract from the outset. It's not something that you can step into from the outside and be like, we've been living together for 20 years. And then one day he just upped and left. And then you don't go to the small claims court and say, I'd like my DVDs back, please. The reason that matters is because you took a kind of a symbolic position with the people all around you, and you made yourself into a unit of society. Now, the state needs to recognise that, because if the state doesn't recognise the actual units that people form and the actual way that they structure their lives, then it's not representing your needs, because there are gay couples all over the USA right now who actually say have been living together, one of them might stay at home and support the other partner while that partner goes out to make loads of money, and whilst if that couple were married, they'd be able to have recourse, and that other person would be able to get, say, 50% of the earnings when they were together, because that was a real committed relationship where one of them supported the other and allowed them to achieve their dreams. Those people are still being shut out, and we need to recognise that it's a unique legal position. It's more than just depending upon each other. It's symbolic and it's social. And so secondly, why is it the state that does that? Well, I've told you that the state has this wonderful power to set a progressive agenda. I've told you that if the state doesn't interfere, then we have couples whose lives are kind of made to look like a lie. Their 40 years together doesn't mean anything. No access to the emergency room, no inheritance rights, no like pre-agreed formulae for how you look after each other's children or how you divide your assets. I want to tell you today, ladies and gentlemen, that the state isn't recognising how people really live their lives, and it needs to step up. I beg to oppose.
Each debater will now get a 5-minute closing argument, and it will begin now.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ettie stood up here and she said, it's a real shame, I can't believe it, that a gay man doesn't have access to the emergency room. He doesn't have access to inheritance rights. He doesn't have access to all of these things. Well, a Mormon spirit wife doesn't have access to all of those things. A heterosexual couple who've chosen not to get married don't have access to all of these things, ladies and gentlemen. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just about spouses here. Your brother doesn't have those rights. Your father, your grandfather doesn't have those rights. Your children doesn't have these rights. I think it's ludicrous that the situation at the moment is that your marriage is exalted above almost every other relationship you have in your life. And exactly what shape that marriage takes is determined not by you, not by your religious organisation that came up with the whole concept in the first place. So potentially the two people and the one group who might be involved. But what is or isn't a legitimate marriage is determined in Washington. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, that is a terrible thing. We ask what creates these rights that Ettie is so concerned about. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, what creates these rights is a social contract that says a man and a woman walking into an emergency room have a different relationship because they have gone through a religious ceremony than anyone else in their life. And I say on this side of the house, no, everyone should be able to define their own rights, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, that might be a little bit legally complex and a bit legally technical. But as we've gone through talking about, the ways in which marriage has evolved over the years, the ways in which initially any woman in this room, if you got married, would have been a chattel, the fact that only white people could get married, the fact that white people couldn't marry black people, we see time and time and time again the state using marriage as a way to back up its own prejudices. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, there's no way in which the state can possibly keep practice with that. So I'd say, ladies and gentlemen, the best way to legalise gay marriage, and indeed any kind of marriage that might develop in the future, is just to not assume that all relationships and all marriages are the same and occur between the same people for the same reasons, but to accept that there are an enormous multiplicity of relationships. There are enormous differences between even heterosexual marriages. Even heterosexual marriages within one religion will be vastly different. And to try and boil these all down to one set of rights that politicians in the 1930s thought was a good idea because they thought, giving people death tax benefits might encourage them to have more children. We don't think that's a good idea, ladies and gentlemen. It also comes down to this notion of religious rights versus individual rights, ladies and gentlemen. Because ultimately you've got to remember that Ettie is offering you a choice. What she's saying is, I don't think the rights of religious organisations are important. I don't think the right of a rabbi or an imam or a priest or a pastor to say no is as valuable as the right of a gay couple to say yes. And ladies and gentlemen, I would say the only way to square this circle, the only way to have a situation where you're not because, what are the rights you're given in the Constitution? You can pursue life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But there's also the freedom of religion is enshrined in the Constitution. And the only way to square that circle is for the state to just wash its hands of the whole marriage issue and to say, we're not going to clamp down on the rights of all of these religious figures, but we're not going to clamp down on the rights of homosexuals either. What Ettie is talking about is discriminating with the full weight of the state against anyone who says, I don't disagree with it. I disagree with this, ladies and gentlemen. We say, ladies and gentlemen, on this side of the House, the best way for the state to legalise gay marriage is to totally get away from the idea is a marriage is a thing that should be legal or legalised in any sense. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, if the state steps back, does your relationship somehow mean more? Does Willard's policy, where overnight the husband that you share your home with or the wife that you have built a family with over 20 years, do they stop meaning anything or do they mean more? Well, I'm going to talk to you about why if the state steps back, relationships kind of lose all of their meaning. And I think that if we extend what he's just told you into a policy, then we get to a situation where marriage doesn't exist at all. So it doesn't speak to the reality of how people actually live their lives. There'll be no protections. There'll be no legal provisions for anything that you want to do. If you want to say, gosh, I'd like it if my wife could inherit my house after I die. That's not possible. So the only protection that would come from society is if you separately take out some kind of contract. So inadvertently, what he's done is he's suggested my proposal. He's basically said that you'd have to go ahead and get some kind of civil marriage separately, because if you want to have any rights that connect you with the person, whether that's a man or a woman or anything else, then you have to do that legally. So he's actually propping my notion of a civil marriage and maybe also a religious one, because he's saying that the state should step out of everything that you do privately. But that's not possible if you want to realistically live a shared life, have shared property, raise children, have an idea of who those children will be raised by if you should die, who the guardian will be, etc., etc. So it just simply doesn't speak to the reality of how we live our lives. Now, on this idea about whether it would be a two-tier understanding of marriage, if you have a civil one and then a religion as well, a religious one as well. Well, what that does is it actually protects against what he claimed was a problem, which was this religious discrimination over what constitutes a marriage. Because under his system, you don't have any kind of marriage and no relationship sort of means any more than any other relationship in a spiritual sense or in a legal sense. But also, that faith community is even more shut out under his understanding of how we regulate marriage. Because that faith community doesn't get to put something, a sacrament that also translates into social meaning on two people. All that faith community gets to do is say, we recognize that these two people share something. Maybe it's in front of God, maybe it's not. It simply means less under his definition, and that's why this civil marriage thing is so important. And that's why we need to be able to sit down and put it in black and white, on paper, in legal writ, that this relationship is important and that it needs to continue to have meaning in the future. Now, what also happens under Willard's proposal, where you get rid of all understanding of marriage whatsoever, is that the old conventional marriages get to keep their weight. So he's not actually allowing the state to step back, and he's not equalizing everybody's relationships and making them totally equally significant. He's just meaning that the older ones that already exist, where old-fashioned people who've grown up with these values for generations and generations, continue to think that that matters. And so when you grow up and look at the world, you see two things. You see that the former Mr. and Mrs., whose relationships have always been sanctioned by society, continue to hold symbolic value. And you see that all the actual relationships that people are having right now in an increasingly progressive and an increasingly open-minded society get no recognition. And you can see that there are boyfriends and boyfriends living together, and you can see that there are girlfriends and girlfriends living together. But you grow up in a society where that doesn't get to mean anything on paper, and where you don't get to call them your husband or your wife, even though other people are still continuing to do that, because old habits die hard. And we think that society is going to continue along the older lines that it always has done. So he's not going to get rid of marriage unless he would like to ban everybody from privately using the word husband, wife, wedding, etc., which might be a little bit over the top. But he's also not going to do anything to protect those people who supposedly ought to be totally free. Because under which system are you more free? If the state steps back entirely and nothing means anything more than anything else, and you take a position of total neutrality, and the government is like, yeah, see you later relationships, we want nothing to do with that, you don't liberate those relationships to mean more in the context of people's lives. You abandon them, and you allow them to be worked out by the most backward and the most inherited cultural values. You allow it to fall to the old-fashioned imam in a small community who says, that doesn't look like a relationship to me because you don't fit my narrow understanding of what two people who love each other look like. And you allow it to fall to the hands of the narrow-minded person in a community where homosexual equals bad. You allow that to dominate, because the state needs to step in and say that, yeah, you can entertain the kinds of values that you like, but you can't put them into practice through actual policy. That's why we say that the religious community is still bound by the laws of the land. That's why it doesn't matter what his, his imam in the community where he lives thinks about homosexuality being totally offensive to God. The state is like, no, that's not cool. These people have rights. So, in essence, where are you freer? Under a society that says you have a legal right to recognize your relationship and to structure your world and your property and your finances around that, or in a world where the government will do nothing for you and you're at the whim of other people? I beg to oppose.
Okay, so that completes our debate. At this time, we're going to ask the audience to show support for the most persuasive argument by standing. So if you side with Willard's argument, please stand now. Oh, no. Okay, there we go. All right. All right, thank you. And if you side with Eddie's argument, please stand now. Okay. All right, well, congratulations, Ettie. Yeah, good job. That adds to it. All right, we just want to thank you all for coming and thank our debaters with a round of applause.